Happy Passover! It is Passover, and you and I are going to make a matzah cake together. So this matzah cake is something I've probably eaten every single year of my life because my mom makes it for Passover, and it's just a traditional Passover cake that is very traditional and really simple to make. So if you want to make it and you have matzah, feel free to make it. We were trying to find the old recipe, and this recipe wooden box, I don't know if you guys have this at home, the Americans amongst us, but we couldn't find it, so I opted to just find another simple recipe online. You can use this recipe that I'm going to link down below in the description, or you can just find one online. It's very simple to make, and there it is, ladies and gentlemen. It's basically matzah layered on top of each other with vanilla pudding layered in between, and then chocolate on top. I'm going to link it in this description. This is basically everything that you're going to need: cream and milk and pudding. You can also do chocolate pudding. We only had keto pudding, and I don't like the aftertaste, so we only used one layer of it, but you can do whatever you want. You have to get a box of matzah. I personally do not like matzah that much, but my mom always buys this huge box, so then we have a lot of them left over. But for those of you guys who have not seen matzah, this is how matzah looks like. It tastes, I don't know, basically like a cracker. It's hard, and then some people basically put it under water or soak it in a bit of milk so that it becomes more soft. And then there's the chocolate. We're going to put the chocolate on top. So let's go make it together. And as I make it, I'm going to tell you guys the story of Passover. So the story of Passover you can find in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, but I would actually recommend reading sort of from the life of Joseph, because then you can see how the Hebrews or the Israelites even got to Egypt. So basically Joseph became a slave. His brothers sold him. He was in Egypt, and then at some point in his life he brought his siblings and his dad, all of them, back to Egypt because there was a famine. Also, there's Buttercup. Enjoy Buttercup. I'm sure you guys haven't seen him in a vlog for a while. He's very cute, and he's very needy and wanting all the food. Also, you're going to need a mixer, and then if you want, you can just take a squarish type plate to put it on. It doesn't have to be anything thick, or it just has to be big enough so that the matzah can fit inside. Back to the story of Passover. Because there was a famine, he brought all of his family down to Egypt. Eventually what happened is that they became slaves to Egypt. The Hebrews, the Israelites, became slaves to Egypt. And they became so many of them that Pharaoh was afraid, and the Egyptians were afraid that they would basically overtake them because there were so many of them. So they decided to make their lives bitter with hard labor. So they would build these cities for them, and they were basically slaves to Egypt. And they were there for 430 years. So how does Moses come into this picture? So because the Egyptians are afraid, they decide to kill all the firstborns of Israel. And so Moses was born. His mother, Yocheved, like the child, didn't want him to die and basically kept him alive for 3 months until she couldn't any longer. So she does something super risky and super heartbreaking. She takes the child, puts him in a basket that can float on the water, and sends him into the Nile, hoping that somehow he will be saved. She sends her daughter after him to see what will become of the child. So she goes after him, and Moses ends up at the palace of the Egyptians. And the daughter of Pharaoh finds him there crying, and she has compassion over him, and she takes him in and raises him as her own child. That must have been a huge controversy. I wonder how she even got through with that, but she did. So for 40 years, he is a prince in Egypt. At some point, he sees an Egyptian that is mistreating a slave, and he decides to kill him. After that, he sees 2 Hebrew slaves and tries to sort of come in between them and say, hey, what are you doing? And they say, who are you to judge between us? You killed that Egyptian. So he becomes super afraid because Pharaoh heard of this, and he's trying to kill him. And so he decides to run for his life. So he escapes Egypt and runs in the desert all the way to Midian. You guys can read all the details of the story if you want in Exodus, but there he meets God in the burning bush, and God sends him back to Egypt and says, I want you to help let my people go because I've heard their cry. And so he's very resistant of it because he's not super brave to go back to where he was just fleeing 40 years ago. And mind you, he was 40 when he escaped Egypt, and then it was 40 years later when he met God at the burning bush. So he's 80 at this point. So God sends him back and says, say that I, Yehovah, sent you. And he goes back to Egypt, and together with his brother Aaron of Yocheved, they go to Pharaoh and they say, we want you to release us to go and worship our God in the desert. And so, of course, Pharaoh is not easily going to just let them go, because those are his slaves. That is his, free laborers. And so he is not happy with it, and he basically says, no, I'm not going to let your people go. And he makes their life even harder in all these different types of ways. And so God brings these 10 plagues upon Egypt. And every single one of these plagues is meant to judge the gods of Egypt, because the Egyptians would make idols, these gods, and worship them. And the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. And he basically, with every single plague, he's like, I'm not going to let you go. Or he would ask of Moses and Aaron to pray to God that he would stop this plague, and God would, but then his heart would become hardened again, and he wouldn't let them go. So he's very, very stubborn, and eventually the last plague, in Hebrew we call them makot, which is like a blow or a bruise, like to strike. The last one was that the firstborn of Egypt would die. And so Moses tells everyone to take a 1-year-old lamb without blemish and slaughter him and eat the meat, take the blood of the lamb and put it on the doorpost, so that when God would come by and see that, he would not strike them. He would basically spare them. And so all of the Israelites did exactly that. They took a lamb, they slaughtered it, they put the blood on the doorpost, and God spared their first child. But in Egypt, meaning with the Egyptians, no one did that. And so their firstborns all died. And so after that plague, I think it was like that was enough for the Egyptians, and they said, take everything and go. And so the Israelites left so much in a hurry that they didn't have time that their bread would rise. And so they basically took everything that they had. They even asked their terrified Egyptian neighbors to give them clothes and gold and silver and all these things, and they basically just left and escaped with their lives. And the reason that we eat matzah is for that reason, that it didn't have time. The bread and stuff didn't have time to rise. And so the tradition, and in this holiday, is that you get rid of all the leaven in your house. All the leaven, all the bread, everything that rises, you get rid of it, and then for 7 days you eat matzah. Or at the very least, you don't eat anything with leaven in it. So that is the story of Passover, and looking at it today, it's such a special thing, because we as a people have gone through so many times in which God has redeemed us and taken us out of different types of slavery and brought us back home. And I think whenever we eat the matzah, it's just a reminder of the fact that he has done that for us every single time. And so that is the story of Passover. This is the cake. It's yummy. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this content, and if you celebrate Passover, I hope that you have a very, very, very happy Passover.